Hi friends, thanks so much for joining us tonight as we continue this semester's faculty seminars through the Sorin Fellows Program. Rooted in the scholarly ethos of the De Nicola Center, these monthly seminars, facilitated by the most exceptional faculty at Notre Dame and beyond, are intended to engage and inform you, our Sorin Fellows, about enduring and contemporary topics surrounding and informed by the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition. The inspiration for this recurring event is really twofold. First, we anticipate that your educational experience at Notre Dame, St. Mary's College, or Holy Cross College will be rigorous and nourishing, no matter if you are an undergraduate student, graduate student, or professional student. However, we believe there are some things so important to an authentically Catholic educational experience that every student, no matter their course of study or professional goals, should not only be exposed to them, but also have a familiarity and appreciation of them, be it with respect to public bioethics, education policy, St. Thomas Aquinas, and more. Now at the same time, and in the interdisciplinary spirit of the Center, we recognize that the requirements of your degree program may preclude you from dedicating a semester to the study of these enduring themes or contemporary issues through a class or even several classes. Leveraging the Center's robust network of excellent faculty on campus and beyond, these faculty seminars are formulated in an effort to allow you the opportunity to build both an introductory familiarity as well as to chart a course forward with the topic through additional resources. Again, like most of our programming this semester, these seminars would best take place in person in a classroom in DeBartolo, OSHAG, or the law school, which we plan on moving forward once our shared life together regains some normalcy. But in the interim, we will host these over Zoom, which will allow you to access and revisit this content at your own leisure, whether in your dorm room or on a walk across campus. The format of these conversations will be as follows. Our guest will lecture for about 30 minutes or so, providing a high-level but substantive treatment of the seminar's topic. Then we'll be joined live via Zoom webinar by our guest so he or she can field questions from Sorin Fellows that arose out of the seminar. That will run for about 20 minutes or so. With that said, it is my pleasure to briefly introduce our guest this evening. Professor Nicole Garnett is a professor of law here at the University of Notre Dame Law School. Her research focuses on property, land use, urban development, local government law, and education policy. She is the author of numerous articles on these subjects and of 2 books, Ordering the City, Land Use, Policing, and the Restoration of Urban America, published by Yale University Press in 2009, and Lost Classroom, Lost Community, Catholic Schools' Importance in Urban America, published out of University of Chicago Press in 2014. Here at Notre Dame, Professor Garnett is also a fellow of the Institute for Educational Initiatives and a senior policy advisor for the Alliance for Catholic Education, as well as a faculty fellow here at the De Nicola Center. From 2008 to 2010, she served as provost fellow at Notre Dame, and during the spring 2007 semester as a visiting professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Garnett received her BA with distinction in political science from Stanford University and her JD from Yale Law School. Following law school, she served as a law clerk for the Honorable Morris S. Arnold of the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit and for Associate Justice Clarence Thomas of the United States Supreme Court. Before joining the law school in 1999, she worked for 2 years as a staff attorney at the Institute for Justice, a nonprofit public interest law firm in Washington, D.C. A regular contributor to the Life of the Center and Sorin Fellows program, Professor Garnett and her husband and fellow law professor Rick have welcomed dozens of Sorin Fellows into their home for numerous supper clubs and discussion groups. For the many of you who have enjoyed their company over dinner or the like, I hope this lecture and question and answer period serves as an opportunity to continue the conversation. As a reminder, Professor Garnett will join us for a live Q&A immediately following her lecture, and you're encouraged to submit your questions through the chat function throughout the lecture, and our staff will do our best to get to them during the live Q&A. So stick around.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you all about parental choice in the United States. I am a big fan of the De Nicola Center, and I have 2 children who are Notre Dame undergraduates. 1.5 of them is a Sorin Fellow. The other one needs to finish his application, Tommy. So today, I want to talk to you about parental choice in the United States, and I'm talking about 3 things you need to know, and then I think the series is called 3 Things You Need to Read, but I actually have 4, so I'm a law professor, so I don't always play by the rules. Okay, so what do you need to know about parental choice? The first is what it is, and in particular, I'm going to focus on private school choice in the United States, but I'd also like to talk to you about, just briefly overview about what other kinds of school choice in the United States is. Sometimes people act like parental choice is some kind of a fringe issue, and it really isn't. It's quite mainstream. It's growing very much so. The second thing I want to tell you about is that parental choice is just, or perhaps why it is just. And then third, I want to talk a little bit about the law and kind of take away some misconceptions about parental choice being unconstitutional or violating the separation of church and state or some other such silliness. Okay, so what is just a little picture of K-12 education in the United States. So 90% of students in schools in the United States attend public schools. So many of you probably attended public schools. They're run by the government. They're run by local school districts that are geographic. About 6% of public school children attend a charter school, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what a charter school is in a second. 10% of students enrolled in schools attend private schools. A majority of the kids in private schools attend faith-based schools. The largest faith-based sector is the Catholic sector, but the number of kids in private schools that are religious has been declining, in large part because of Catholic school closures in the United States. And about 3% of American school-aged children are homeschooled. Now, if you add up 90, 10, and 3, you do not get 100. That took a long time for me to figure out. The 90 and the 10 are actually students in schools, and the other are just children at home or homeschooled. So that's sort of what American education looks like. So what is school choice? I would just briefly talk about the first two, public school choice and charter schools, and then private school choice. Public school choice. So many of you chose your schools because your parents chose them for you by moving. That's the number one way American parents choose schools in the United States. They move to school districts. It's the number one reason. If asked, people ask, why did you move here? The number one reason is the schools. So people who have the ability to choose their schools, some by sending their kids to private schools, but many by actually just moving. So within public school districts, many districts, including most urban districts, have open enrollment. So technically, if you live in the city of Chicago, you can attend any school in the city of Chicago. This is a little less common in the suburbs. Certainly where I grew up, your enrollment was determined by where you lived, by sort of the geography. There are magnet schools that are public schools run by school districts that tend to be themed, that some of them have to take a test to get into. Some of you may have gone to a magnet school. Those as a form of public school choice. And then in some states, there's inter-district choice. So you don't just have choices within your school district, but you can move from one school district to another. That's public school choice. Okay, so what are charter schools? So charter schools are technically privately operated public schools. So charter schools are called public schools by state laws, but they are almost all run privately by nonprofits. They're created by an agreement, the charter, which is an agreement between the school operator and this thing called an authorizer. And you don't really need to know what that is, but it's sometimes the government and sometimes not. But basically, it is the charter is like a compact that says this is the kind of school we have. It's going to be a Montessori school, or it's going to be a STEM school. And this private operator will operate that school, and they get public funds. Usually not the same amount of public funds as kids that are enrolled in public schools per pupil, about 80% in most districts, most cities. Of the funds that are given per pupil to district public school kids. So the charter schools have grown exponentially over the last few decades. The first charter school law was passed in 1991 in Minnesota. Now there are about 3 million or so kids in charter schools in the United States, and 44 states have charter schools. Just to put that in perspective, when I graduated from high school, which seems like a long time to you, in 1988, there was effectively no school choice in the United States, some magnet schools, but mostly we went to the public school that was assigned to us, and there was no public funding whatsoever for charter schools or for private school choice. So that was only in 1988. That's not that long ago. One other thing about charter schools is just the only 6% of kids in the United States are enrolled in charter schools. The number is much, much higher in some districts, particularly urban districts. So this is a little states with more than 10% of their kids in charter schools, but in 7 districts, more than 40% of the public school kids are now attending charter schools. In the New Orleans public schools, there are no traditional public schools anymore. The only public schools are charter schools. Detroit, Washington, D.C., Newark. So if you live in one of these big cities, you may feel like charter schools they're a really important presence. And one of the reasons they're such an important presence in urban districts is because many of these people are very mission oriented and their goal is to serve the poor. And many of these schools they do a great job. They're really excellent schools. A majority of kids in charter schools are racial minorities. And the evidence suggests that African Americans, Latinos do much better than their district peers when they enroll in a charter school. Interestingly, particularly African Americans in math and English language learners in reading. So that's charter schools. I'm going to go backwards because I didn't order my slides right. Okay, what is private school choice? The rest of this talk is going to be about private school choice. This is something that's very important to me. Again, a little historical perspective. Although the government, state and federal governments have funded private schools, including religious schools, off and on throughout history, including mission schools on Native American reservations, mission schools for freed slaves. The first formal voucher program in the United States was not enacted until 1990, the private school choice program. It was a modest voucher scholarship program that let 500 kids in Milwaukee go to private schools. It's grown, that particular program has grown exponentially. There are more than 20,000 kids enrolled in that program now. And school choice has grown exponentially as well. So a little primer on private school choice. So there are basically 2 main ways that private school choice works. And by private school choice, I mean ways in which parents, particularly poor parents, are able to access public resources in order to send their child to a private school. Most of the kids participating in these programs go to faith-based schools. So there are 3 types. About half of programs are voucher programs. And voucher programs, which include, Indiana has one of the largest voucher programs, it's effectively a scholarship program. So a scholarship, if my kids go to St. Joe Grade School, St. Joe High School, Maggie and Tommy Garnett went to both of those places. And about a third of the kids in those schools get some scholarship money from the state of Indiana. So the kid comes, the kid's qualified, the principal says, so-and-so is here, and send us the scholarship. That's a voucher program. About half of programs are voucher programs. Some of those voucher programs are targeted at means tested, so they're for poor kids. The largest programs are means tested programs for disadvantaged children. And some of those voucher programs or scholarship programs are targeted for special needs children. The other really big kind of private school choice is called scholarship tax credits. And what scholarship tax credit programs do is they give people an incentive to donate to private scholarship funds. So if I were living in the state of Florida and I were a corporation, I could give my corporate income tax either to the state of Florida or a private scholarship program called Step Up for Students. Step Up for Students would give it to poor kids to go to private schools in Florida. This is just a little map that shows you where, you can study this, but where school choice is in the United States. About half of all states have some private school choice program now, and the District of Columbia. Again, about half of those programs are scholarship tax credit programs. About half of those programs are voucher programs. Large percentages of them are for disadvantaged kids, and then there are some that are for special needs kids. Now, school choice is increasing. The footprint is growing. More and more states. A lot of people are actually surprised when I say half of states have a private school choice program. People think it's sort of a weird fringe issue, but it's important to keep in mind that it's just a tiny, tiny bit of money. So, in about the last numbers that we have, about $706 billion are spent on K-12 education last year in the United States. And it says the number, about 0.3% of that was allocated to a private school choice program. So despite the fact that these programs are serving these kids, they're sending them to good schools, very, very little funding goes to private schools in the United States. And most of these programs the scholarship does not cover tuition. So in most of the cases, either the parents or the school makes up the difference. So this is just a little bit of a map showing a very cool little graphic showing the increase in the number of kids that are enrolled in private school choice programs from 500 in 1990 to 520 last year. That's a pretty big increase, but again, it's important to keep in mind that there are 56 million kids in K-12 schools. So basically about less than 1% of American school children are participating in one of these programs. More and more every year, but they're still quite modest. Okay, that's charter school. So that's what school choice is. I'm going to talk in the rest of my time, first I'm going to talk about the justice of school choice, and then I want to tell you a little bit about the law. So school choice is just. So this is a school choice rally with some kids that participated in the school choice program. You can see that we love school choice, kids first. One thing you'll notice about these kids is they're predominantly African American. Majority of kids participating in private school choice and charter school programs are poor and disadvantaged kids, and so this has been a passion for me for as long as I can remember. I actually participated as a lawyer when I was very young in the defense of the first school choice program in Milwaukee. When Milwaukee passed the school choice program in 1990, I joined a small nonprofit law firm in 1996. Right after that, it was a Wisconsin program. Wisconsin had said, okay, for the first time, we're going to let religious schools participate in the program. I was involved in defending that program against a challenge that was unconstitutional. And I have a very vivid memory. In Milwaukee, the public schools at the time were terrible. At least two of them had a 12% graduation rate. And I remember it was a cold day. We were going to the argument in the United States at the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which is in Madison, Wisconsin. And we were standing in a parking lot loading kids and parents onto buses. And what I saw in these parents was both hope and fear. You could see in their eyes that there was hope that these schools were going to make a difference in their children's lives, and fear that the courts were going to take it away from them. And so when we got to the courthouse, which is in the state capitol in Madison, we packed the courtroom with parents. And the lawyer is a story that really captures to me the justice of school choice. There's a large Hmong population in Milwaukee. There were refugees from the Vietnam War, and Hmongs tend to be Catholic, ethnically Catholic. They're an ethnic minority in Vietnam, and they tend to be Catholic. And so the lawyer for the opponents, which were saying this was a horrible thing, that we were allowing kids to go to religious schools with public funds, it was unconstitutional and un-American. And he said very angrily, these people are trying to undermine our democracy. They're trying to undermine our basic American institutions. And he gestures like this, and his hand was about this far away. It was like a little toothless grandma from a Hmong grandma, wrinkled, slouching in her chair. And she didn't look like she was trying to undermine any basic American institutions. What she looked like is that she wanted her kids, her grandchildren, to have a better life than she had had. And this program was going to give it to them. One little thing I don't want to go into the data on school choice and private school choice. It's very, very big. Lots of studies about whether it works, quote unquote, works or not. But one thing that's quite clear is participating in one of these programs, regardless of what the test scores are, they dramatically change life outcomes. If you are a disadvantaged child and you were able to go to a private school or a charter school, but a private school in particular through a choice program, you're far more likely to graduate from high school, to go to college, to graduate from college. You're far more likely, there's a recent study, not to go to jail of the Milwaukee program. And this is particularly true with respect to urban Catholic schools. And if you move from a public school to a private school because of a school choice program, there's also evidence that you become more tolerant of diversity and have more knowledge of your basic American institutions, the ones that lady was trying to undermine. So, school choice is just. Most countries fund a range of private and public schools. In Chile, for example, they have a universal voucher program, and 65% of Chilean children return to a private school, including a faith-based school. Australia is another example. Australia has a very interesting system where every kid gets the same amount of money no matter what kind of school they go to. Every school, public and private, participates in the public funding program. And the schools, public and private, get more money if they take more poor kids. So it's sort of an ideal program designed to incentivize schools to serve disadvantaged disadvantaged kids. We don't have that much funding, as I just told you, in the United States because of a variety of reasons, but a huge one is the legacy of anti-Catholicism in the United States. So what we have is a system where we have most American school children are attending public schools, district-run schools. Most of those kids are in good public schools, chosen by their parents because they can afford to choose to live and buy a big house in a nice school district. And then we have other kids that are trapped in failing public schools that do not serve them well. Because their parents don't have the resources to send them to a private school, and their parents don't have the resources to move. And we don't fund kids in faith-based schools except in this tiny little way. And it's such a dramatic departure from the international norm, we have to ask why it is. And I want to talk just a little bit about why that is, and that's the legacy of anti-Catholicism in American education policy. So this is one of my favorite cartoons. So this is a cartoon that I have on my wall. Some of you probably have taken a class with Professor Schoenig. I know Maggie's in Professor Schoenig's class. He has this on his wall too. So in the 19th century, as American public school system was really starting in earnest, there were also lots of people coming from Catholic countries to the United States for the first time, in particular the Irish, because of the potato famine. So the schools that were being founded and were called public were predominantly Protestant in their approach. The kids had to read the King James Bible. They were forced to do Protestant devotions in class. There's plenty of examples of kids that refused to read the King James Bible or refused to say the devotions, getting beaten. The founders of many American public school systems were rabidly anti-Catholic, and they made clear that they thought Catholics were a threat to Americans, that they were not Christians, and that they swore allegiance to the whore of Babylon and other such things, and that the public schools were a way to Americanize these kids and Americanize them by Protestantizing them. So eventually the Catholics fought back. They were tired of this, and the bishops decided, beginning in the 1850s, that they were going to build a separate school system, which became the largest private school system in the world, which is the American Catholic school system. The bishops originally believed that they would be able to get public funds for the schools. After all, the public schools were private, but the public schools were mostly Protestant. But this really prompted a huge amount of backlash. They asked for funds, and it didn't work out. So I love this little cartoon because it really captures the moment. You will see the brave man like this. He's a public school teacher protecting the poor children who are kneeling and praying for their salvation. You can't really see it closely, but he has the Holy Bible stuck in his lapel. They're dragging a public school teacher off to the gallows, and these crocodile alligator figures are coming to eat them. And if you look very, very carefully at the crocodile alligator figures, you will see that they're bishops and that their vicious teeth are miters. And actually you really can't see it, but if you you see the Vatican in the background, it actually says on the front of it, the Political Roman Catholic School. So this effort to get public funds for Catholic schools fails. It fails politically. It prompts a huge backlash. And many states start amending their own there's an effort to amend the federal constitution by a guy named James G. Blaine, who was a senator from Maine. He really wanted to be president. He thought anti-Catholicism was a pretty good platform. So he attempts to amend the federal constitution to prohibit the funding of sectarian schools. My husband likes to say that sectarian is a dirty word for someone else's religion. And in particular, sectarian means anti-Catholicism. I mean, sectarian, the Catholics were not Christian, they were sectarian. This effort to block this effort to amend the U.S. Constitution fails, fortunately, but many states start amending their own constitutions. These are often called Blaine Amendments, sometimes called baby Blaine Amendments. Some states were actually required to insert one of these anti-Catholic provisions in their constitutions in order to enter the Union as a state. This history gets baked into American public schools. We become the argument that little old lady, the little Hmong grandmother, was trying to undermine American institutions is really tied back to this idea that public schools are a part of who we are as people and they're necessary for democracy, evidence, aside, and that Catholic schools are other, not worthy. They're places where we're teaching people to be bad Americans, they have dual allegiance. Dual allegiance is in the news a lot lately. They have dual allegiance to the Pope, and they're not good Americans. And so it would be really a threat to American institutions to fund them. They get baked into the sort of the ethos of our education system. They get baked into our culture. I think many Americans think public schools are good, solid, as apple pie kind of institutions. And I was a public school kid. I was well educated in public schools. I support public schools. But I think it's important to just remember why it is that they are they have this overwhelming, almost oligopoly, a monopoly on our educating kids in the United States. And they also get baked into the law. So starting in the 20th century, there's a series of cases that the Supreme Court starts saying the government can't fund religious education. And it takes a long time to get to a case that I'm about to tell you about called Zellman, which says that you can actually use public funds to send poor kids to private schools. So it gets baked into the law, and therefore there's not much innovation. It's believed to be unconstitutional to send kids to faith-based schools with public funds. Okay, so with that history in mind, and what I've said about sort of anti-Catholicism, this sort of the assumption that you can't fund kids attending religious schools, I want to tell you just a little bit about the Constitution, in particular the United States Constitution. So some people argue that providing public resources for kids to go to faith-based schools is un-American. They continue to make that argument. But many people will say, well, doesn't that violate the separation of church and state? That's just wrong. First of all, those words are not in the Constitution, and no informed person should ever say them. If anybody asks you, isn't it a violation of the separation of church and state, just say you don't know what they're talking about because you've studied the Constitution and you've never seen those words in it. What they're talking about is the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These provisions are commonly known. The first one is the Establishment Clause, and the second one is the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause was put in the Constitution for a very good reason, which was to prevent the federal government from establishing the Anglican or Episcopal Church as the national church, in part because many states at the time had established churches. So this was a federalism provision by and large. But over time, it becomes a way that the Supreme Court starts basically constantly having to ask itself, when is it unconstitutional to provide government benefits to religious institutions, in particular schools? And there's a really long history that I don't have time to talk about, but I just want to talk about two cases. Okay, the first one is a case that was decided in 2002, a case that I worked on as a young lawyer for just a little tiny bit. And it's called Zellman. I'm going to have you read it in a minute. But in 2002, the Supreme Court held that a voucher program that included religious schools did not violate the U.S. Constitution's Establishment Clause. So that's the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. It was a modest program serving poor kids in Cleveland. 96% of them were in religious schools. The court said it doesn't matter. The reason it doesn't matter is what the Establishment Clause requires is the government behave neutrally toward religion. And by the way, the government's not making any decisions whatsoever about where that money goes, but the parents are. Okay, so that's important. That opens the door for experimentation with school choice. The second, though, is brand new, and it's also really important. And it remained a question between 2002 and 2020, just a couple months ago, whether or not a state could have a school choice program but exclude religious schools if it wanted to. And the Supreme Court decided in June 2020 that it couldn't. Basically, what the Supreme Court said is to exclude religious schools from a program of private choice is religious discrimination. And that violates the Free Exercise Clause, the second half of the Religion Clause coin. That's a really important case because the reason that the schools were excluded was one of those Blaine amendments I just talked about. It was the state of Montana. And it was quite clear that the state of Montana's Blaine amendment had anti-Catholic origins. The court doesn't go into that. It just says, look, you have to treat religious schools and non-religious schools equally. You can't just kick them out for being religious. That's a violation of the Free Exercise Clause. So not only does the Supreme Court said that you can include religious schools in a private school choice program, the Supreme Court has said if you have a private school choice program, you must include religious schools, because what the First Amendment requires is neutrality toward religion. Okay, so those are the three things you need to know. And I'm going backwards again. What to read? The first thing you should read is two cases. This is better than books, they're shorter. I actually think if you've got the time, read the dissents and the concurrences too. I will particularly, I'm a Justice Thomas clerk, but I will particularly recommend Justice Thomas's concurrence in Zellman versus Simmons-Harris. It's very powerful. It starts out with a Frederick Douglass quote. The Frederick Douglass quote is, "Education means liberation. It means light and liberty." So Zellman is the case that upheld private school choice against an Establishment Clause challenge. It says that you can include religious schools. In fact, even if 96% of the kids are using their funds to go to religious schools, that's their business, not ours. And the second case is Espinoza versus Montana, which is a new case. And it's the case I just told you about that said that if you have a private school choice program, you can't exclude religious schools. Okay, that's what you need to read. What else do you need to read? 2 articles. Okay, the first is the best article, in my view, ever written about school choice. It's a 1992 First Things magazine article by Jack Koons, who's a 92-year-old man, a professor at the University of Berkeley School of Law. He has been writing about school choice from a Catholic social justice perspective since the 60s. And in this piece, he makes the argument, the title captures it all. School choice isn't just a good idea. It's not just good policy. And it's not just about improving outcomes. It's about empowering people and giving them, parents, poor people, and giving them dignity and voice. And one of the things I love about this article is he says, for an uneducated person, we speak through our children, and to be able to choose your child. And also uneducated poor people are often told they don't matter, their opinions don't matter, that they don't have a choice, they don't have a voice. And if you say, here, we're going to let you choose who you want your child to be. Do you want your child in a Catholic school or a Muslim school? Do you want your child in a Montessori school? School choice is simple justice. The second article is mine. It's pretty good. The reason I assigned it is, because it's good, but it's brand new. It tells you all about the landscape of parental choice. In particular, it makes the argument that parental choice is needed even though we have charter schools, because faith-based and particularly Catholic schools serve a really unique function. and have long served that function. And we need school choice, we need parental choice, because in part, if we don't get parental choice, we're going to lose these precious faith-based institutions that have served the poor and given them dignity for decades. So if you don't read both articles, just read Jack Koons. He's amazing. Thanks.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, friends. And thank you, Professor Garnett, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, we've had some questions come in over the course of your wonderful presentation, and I'm hoping to dive right in and make the most of these about 15 minutes or so.
Great.
So one of them comes from a student who says, I don't plan on becoming a Catholic school teacher or administrator. How can I help promote parental choice, like in my local community or otherwise, whether through policy, especially with respect to Catholic schools, both now, kind of where they are now currently, and in the future, perhaps as a parent?
Well, I think that it's a great question. So you can be an informed citizen and understand the arguments and be able to rebut the arguments, and also just sort of be able to articulate the arguments about why this matters, especially in the lives of the disadvantaged. So, that's I would say is the most important thing, is just to understand what the landscape of school choice is and what the arguments for school choice are, and why and why the arguments against it are wrongheaded. I also think, look, we serve our communities and we serve our schools. We're going to be called to serve in all kinds of ways. I've been speaking a lot to the press lately about Judge Barrett, and one of the things I emphasize is how, for me, she models service in the way she serves in large and small ways. So she's a room mother, and she sends her kids to the Catholic schools. She's been on the parish council, and there's always going to be ways in which supporting local institutions and with your own time, talent, and treasure is really important.
Absolutely. Thank you. This question comes from Olivia, who asks, how would you address the argument that universalizing school choice policies would cause failing public schools to collapse without funds? Or is universalizing school choice not an ideal policy?
So first of all, Olivia, I believe, like me, is a Kansan. So every question Kansans ask, brilliant. But I would say, first of all, I'm not sure. I think the questions about how we design parental choice policies are important. But I'm not really what I care about kids are not systems. And so I think that the question has to be, how do we serve, what system, what way do we serve children, particularly children that don't have any, that are of limited means? And so I guess I think, first of all, I think it's not true that parental choice would cause public schools to collapse. It's not the case that in any place with parental choice, public schools have collapsed. But my main concern, the answer I would say, is what do you say to the parent, the poor parent who wants to send their child to a Catholic school or a charter school, and the answer is, well, we can't let your kid have a chance, because if we let your kid have a chance, then golly, this system will collapse. If I'm a parent, I just don't find that an acceptable argument.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I want to transition a little bit more to the legal side here a bit. So Espinoza v. Montana was clearly a victory for religious education, but doesn't necessarily mean smooth sailing, organizationally, culturally, or legally moving forward. So as you look out at the next kind of 5 to 10 years of private ed and religious ed, what are some of the challenges you anticipate, whether internal to the schools themselves organizationally, or even perhaps additional external kind of cultural or legal forces at work?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. So first of all, Espinoza versus Montana says that if you have a parental choice program, you can't exclude religious schools. Unless we expand that reasoning to charter schools, its impact is legally important, but practically in the short run, not very much so. I guess I would say, so it's not going to make school choice. The court makes clear that no one has to have school choice. So you can have parental choice if you want to, and if you have it, you have to include religious schools. but that doesn't mean you have to have school choice at all. So it's not sort of a magic bullet. I think there's a lot of really things that we should be quite concerned about in the faith-based and private school world. The first is the decline of the number of faith-based schools, especially those that are serving poor kids, especially Catholic schools. The number of Catholic schools that have closed in the last few decades is shocking, thousands and thousands. The enrollment declines are even more precipitous. Schools that have for decades served the poor and served them well are closing in even higher numbers. So that's really a crisis, and COVID has accelerated that. A lot of schools, private faith-based schools that have were forced to close because of COVID, will never open their doors. Probably already 200 Catholic schools have said because of COVID they won't reopen. So it's an emergency. And so I just think one of the things about parental choice, private school choice in particular, is if we don't get it soon, it's going to be too late. There won't be any schools for these kids to go to. I think, though, on the private school side, we can talk a lot about how faith-based schools might respond more effectively to opportunities that are presented to them. Faith-based schools or private schools in general, but faith-based schools and Catholic schools in particular tend to be kind of allergic to transparency. They don't really want to tell their stories at a school level way. They don't want to talk about how they're doing. They want to tell a global story, like we're good, but they don't want to talk about Corpus Christi School or Holy Cross School. So I think our schools, Catholic schools in particular, could be better at being transparent. And I think that's really important. I also think Catholic schools faith-based schools, but Catholic schools are the ones that I know the best. Catholic schools could do they should recognize their own limitations and always try to improve. So where parental choice becomes available, faith-based schools need to be prepared to make the case that they are transforming lives, and they have to actually transform lives. Sometimes in parental choice states, you get the sense that like the game is filling seats that were otherwise empty, but what we have to do is fill seats and change lives. A friend of mine who is working with a group of Catholic schools called the Partnership Schools. They've had 5 schools in the Bronx and Harlem. It's a private organization that runs Catholic schools for the Archdiocese of New York. The Pope visited one of these schools during his recent visit. And they've expanded to Cleveland. And he said that since they've expanded the partnership schools they've helped, they're trying to transform just 2 inner city Cleveland schools. They've had 40% enrollment increases. Wow. And they have school choice, they have vouchers in Cleveland. So the challenge is those 40% extra kids their lives have to be transformed. And it can't just be resting on our laurels, we're really good. Because we're better than the alternative, but that's not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So getting to that point, especially with respect to the goods that are uniquely produced through this kind of schooling. So the value of, say, public higher education is often kind of defended by reference to, say, graduates' increased participation in like voting or socioeconomic upward mobility or other like civic values that are necessary to like a functioning democracy, or at least a healthy one, maybe perhaps. And you touch on this in your talk. What are the kind of like longitudinal statistics or outcomes that we can point to kind of leverage the goods of a program like it may be Seton that you're talking about in New York, or whatever one it is, being kind of beneficial, particularly for the local community in which those schools are being kind of supported?
Right. So I think the first is, there's evidence, and there are different kinds of academic evidence about the effects of Catholic schools and school choice. Those are different questions on the poor and disadvantaged. I think those are really important. So there's a long record, a social science record in particular, about urban Catholic schools and their transformative effects on poor kids. And so the disadvantaged kids that are attending Catholic schools are more likely to persist in and graduate from high school, to go to college, to graduate from college, just to earn more money. And there's a second set of social science evidence, which is about participation in parental choice programs. that participation, that evidence suggests that like on test scores, the effects are beneficial but marginal, just at them. But on other things like life events, whether or not you graduate from high school, go to college, stay in college, get a job, all those things, get married, those are pretty phenomenal effects of just participating in a private school choice program. There is also evidence that private schools, particularly faith-based and Catholic schools, are good civic educators. Our own David Campbell at the University of Notre Dame, he's the chair of the political science department, has a lot of research on this, and he demonstrates not only do kids who attend private schools tend to be better educated about civic events, civic life, and more tolerant, more knowledgeable about democracy, more committed to service, more tolerant of diversity. But in fact, you can isolate the effect on school choice. So if you transfer from a public to a private school, there's a positive civic effect. This is almost entirely driven by Catholic schools. You take Catholic schools out, public and private schools do about the same. So that's another thing. The final thing is just some of my own research that I did with my colleague, now retired Peg Brennick, who was a lawyer and an economist. We wrote a book about the effect of Catholic schools closing on urban neighborhoods. And we found when a Catholic school closes, we studied Chicago and Philadelphia, the neighborhood becomes more dangerous, more disorderly, and less socially cohesive. And so, these institutions aren't just good at educating kids, but they're also anchoring community institutions.
Tremendous. Thank you. So a question that I think might be on the mind of some of our undergraduate Sorin fellows as they are discerning their next steps post-grad. And also, I think, kind of intimately tied to kind of the process of a lessening of vocations in the religious orders who may have founded some of these primary and secondary schools, questions about ACE come up. And so a more practical question. So an underclassman is thinking about doing ACE after undergrad. Can you share a little bit about your experience working with ACE, and from your perspective, speak to maybe some of its benefits, both for the students who participated in it and for the schools in which they serve?
So I don't work directly with the ACE teachers. I work on the education and policy side of the work they do, particularly serving the church and working with bishops to help the bishops take advantage of parental choice and be better advocates for parental choice. As an outsider, in some ways, I could see both the transformative effects. I've been told multiple times that ACE teachers change the lives, that they change the school culture and make it healthier. They make it less likely to close. They've changed lives. We have Notre Dame students, undergrads who are ACE, who've been taught by ACE students, ACE teachers, that is. And I also think I've been struck by how beautifully transformative the experience is in the faith lives of the teachers who participate. And they tend to, a lot of folks come in saying, well, this is a service thing I want to do for a couple of years, and they stick around forever. They become principals, they become superintendents. There's a number of Catholic school superintendents now who did ACE. They go into higher education to teach teachers. So yeah, it's a really important thing. I do think your point, Pete, about vocations is important. I mean, although beautiful, the sisters of, Nashville Dominicans and others, the nuns aren't coming back. Like, we have to find a new vocational model to serve our schools. And I think having committed young people giving their lives to these schools is really important, and committed young lay people.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if that's all right. Sure. So this comes from Nicholas DeAndrea, 1L. So he asks, how much is parochial education contingent upon church attendance? And can it be efficient without the private funding and support of local community members to their local parishes?
So, I guess it's a chicken and an egg thing, right? So there's lots of evidence that kids who go to Catholic schools are more likely to remain committed Catholics throughout their lives. So that's part of it. I do think that one of the struggles that urban Catholic schools in particular have had is declining church attendance. And I also think that one of the struggles that Catholic schools have had is just, so y'all are young. I'm a convert. I went to public school. I had no experience with Catholic schools at all until I started teaching at Notre Dame, and I have 4 Catholic school kids now, but including 2 1.5 Sorin Fellows, as I said, to Notre Dame students.
Yeah.
You know, I do think one of the problems is that as fewer and fewer parents have had the experience of Catholic education, they don't understand it. So for me and my husband, neither of us went to Catholic schools. We're both public school kids. It was such a beautiful and transformative experience to have our kids in Catholic schools and to experience kind of that full-on community life and formation as opposed to just education. And so we're losing that. And it's hard to get it back. That is to say, it's harder to make the case to younger parents who had no experience with Catholic schools what the value proposition is. And so that's something we have to think about. How do we get people in the door? I think a bishop told me sometimes at ACE we give talks to bishops, like little meetings. And this one bishop told me, he thought I was kind of clever. He said whenever his pastors have a school, he would always make them do baptism prep in the school just to get the young parents in the school. Because it's not just about the financial support of the parish, that it's also about the parents understanding why you would think about doing this as opposed to something else. And also, look, the school feeds the parish. I mean, a healthy school makes a healthy parish. I mean, certainly at St. Joe Parish, where I attend, my husband and I attend, our kids have attended, and one still does. You know, the fact is lots of parents are showing up at church in part because they just want to get on the they want to get the front of the list to get into the school. And then that causes them to come back to church and get involved in the church. And so I think, I think the church itself, the school is an important evangelizing mission of the church and vice versa. So we have to evangelize the parents about the value of the school, but we also have to understand that having a school can evangelize the parents about the value of the commitment to the church.
Absolutely. I think that's a phenomenal answer, in my humble opinion, and a great way to end. So Professor Garnett, thank you so much for joining us this evening and providing such a great presentation. And thank you from the center and from all our Sorin Fellows for all the work that you've been doing over the last week or so, and I'm sure the work that you'll be doing going forward.
I'm actually have to be on TV at 11:30 tonight, which is nice.
Oh, this is great practice then. Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Have a great
everybody.
day. Thank you.
All right. Bye.